Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and Info Voices. I'm sure you've heard that before, but I'm from both those groups. And this is one of our regular webinars, but it's one of the webinars that we do when we interview a local author. And in Info, we've got several really good authors who've written some really interesting and compelling books. And today we've got Elaine Graham Leigh again, because we've already interviewed her when she wrote a non-fiction book on, believe it or not, climate change and Marx. And she has now written not a non-fiction, but she's gone into fiction, and she's written a science fiction book of all things. And we're going to talk to her about that, about the book itself and why she chose that particular genre. So Elaine, thanks for joining us today, and that's really great. Can I ask you, first of all, I mean, you're a political activist, you've written about politics, you've spoken about politics. So what motivated you to decide you wanted to write a novel, and a science fiction one at that?
Well, I mean, writing fiction has always been my first love. And it's true that that for a long time I sort of, I put that aside, just treated that as a hobby, because it seemed to me that, you have to spend your time on things that are more important. So it was kind of about finding a way that that my fiction writing could also be politically relevant, which is something that science fiction lets me do. I mean, and the sort of science fiction I write is very much politics in space. So it's a way of being able to explore, why our leaders behave as they do, why our world works as it does, and so on, but in a fictional way.
Well, I'm going to ask you some questions about politics and space as we go along, and I quite like that term. I mean, the book you've written is called the Caduca. I hope I pronounced it right.
Hard to say, Kaduka.
Kaduka.
It's Latin, not Italian.
Okay, I was told wrongly then, and I followed the wrong advice.
It doesn't
matter. Anyhow, why did you choose that name?
Right. Well, it's a complicated, somewhat fictional derivation from Caduceus, which is the doctor's symbol with the sort of the snakes wound round the rod. So my Terran Empire that I'm imagining about 900 years in the future has had a whole period of using Latin as the kind of the sort of the governmental language and so on. So they have all these words that are derived from Latin, but their meanings have shifted. So the Kaduka is a figure in the novel that's derived from some developments in sort of folklore, if you like, based on the Caduceus, the snake symbol.
Well, I have some questions on that as well, because I actually find it a fascinating name and a fascinating concept. But I'm going to ask you a difficult question now, and that is, can you very briefly tell us the plot of the book?
Yeah, sure. So as I said, this is almost 900 years from now, and the premise is that humans have gone into space, and we've had the great and glorious Terran Empire and settled all sorts of planets, and then that's all fallen apart. So you've got all of these human colonized planets out there that are now mostly very poor, mostly have some sort of dictatorial government. So the Kaduka is set on one of these planets called Benantai. And the plot is that when the major power in the galaxy, who is not humans, they're an alien race called the Chime, decide that they want to extend their sphere of influence. They want to get to Benantai under their control. So it's around two characters, one of whom is Chime, one of whom is one of the humans on Benantai, and how they're involved in that Chime attempt to get control of the planet and what they do about it.
It's quite a sort of complex book in all the storyline. How did you go about writing it? Did you sort of sit down and start writing it and sort of discover where you were going to end up? Or did you meticulously plan it from the start?
Oh, I'm very much a planner. So this was all planned out in quite a lot of detail, and my notes for the book are way longer than the book itself. So I mean, I did change my mind quite a lot when I was planning it. So where it ended up isn't where I originally thought it was going to end up, but that's all at the planning stage. I can't write anything unless I've worked out exactly how long this section has to be and exactly what's going to happen next, and so on.
Well, it's a really classic story of oppression and resistance, and of outside interference coming from another planet to try and negotiate reconciliation. So it's got a lot of elements of chaos and confusion. So, and I mean, you partly answered this, but were you using science fiction to reflect the world we actually live in.
Yes, very much so. I mean, it's not an allegory. It's not that you can say, okay, the Chime are this power and the other races are that power, or anything like that. But it's very much, it's using science fiction as an opportunity to discuss what's happening now in our world at one remove. I mean, the Chime and their attempt to get to get control of Benantai very much started with me thinking about the kind of what used to be termed the new military humanism, that kind of very much the sort of Blair and sort of Clinton wars, where we're told that we're saving the places that we're intervening in and bombing and so on, and it's for their benefit. And I think the Chime kind of started in as very much that sort of figure, I think, which is why at the beginning there's a quotation from a radio interview that I heard at sort of 4 in the morning in 1999 from someone in Belgrade, talking about the NATO bombing there. So that was very much that's the sort of thing that I was starting off from.
Yeah, I had a feeling you were taking your views out into the stratosphere and working on it there. But I mean, were you doing more than that? Yeah, sure, you were telling a story. Sure, you were making a political point. But were you also trying to use science fiction to sort out your own confusion around ideas, something we all have to do from time to time?
Yes, I think to an extent. I mean, the Caduca was kind of quite a long time in the writing, and I think I became much clearer about what I thought about these things as the sort of writing process went on. But certainly, I mean, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but certainly the Chime character in the book comes to see the world very differently at the end than she does at the beginning, and that, in a sense, reflects, I think, my understanding when I first became involved in politics. She has a moment where she's like, oh, that's how it works. And certainly I very much remember my own, oh, right, that's how the world works moment. So yeah, to an extent, I think I'm still working it out as I go along.
So there's still room for other eureka moments for you, but there's still the classic Elaine in there, isn't there? The Marxist approach. There's a resistance has got to be total. It can't be fractional or factional. And via Vera, the sort of opposition, the resistance, shows the deficiencies of the fractional approach. So you were trying to show that, weren't you?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, Via Vera have become an incredibly violent resistance movement that actually are pretty much preying on the people, really. So they have control of a fairly sort of isolated mountainous area on Benantai, and they have sort of tax parties that go out and seize resources from the villagers around, and they capture young men and make them join, and all this sort of thing. So they've completely lost touch, really, with the people that they're supposed to be fighting for, except in that oppressive way. And this was very much thinking through, well, actually, this is one of the major ways that sort of armed resistance movements go wrong. So I'm sort of trying to think, well, why does that happen? And actually, how can you avoid it? Is very much part of what I'm trying to do with them.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because you show fractional, conflict doesn't work, but you also show how Via Vera actually went down the wrong path. But you also show, I think, how parochial human beings can be when they have global aspirations. I think one of your characters says that those folk fighting for passion often live in a maze, thinking the maze is the whole world. I think that's a really good message. Did you really think about that, want to get that over as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's natural that people think about, their own sort of specific surroundings, and I don't think that'll change. Sometimes with these kind of people sort of imagining what the future would be like if we were living out in space or whatever, you kind of think that you'd have this sort of galaxy-wide viewpoint, and people don't really. People are always concerned with what's next to them. But part of what I'm thinking about with Via Vera is they're not really seeing what's right next to them because they've lost that connection.
And that I guess is true of all of us at some point in our time. And we all live in that maze. We all have our own sort of worldview that we develop. But you also show conflicts that are really interesting. I mean, the two central characters, I guess, are Therese and Quiller. And Therese is a person who actually illustrates the human dilemma when faced with an ideology and personal love. And she's willing to talk to the opposition, even collaborate with the opposition in order to sort of save the person she loves, who is not a very nice person, by the way. But is that the sort of Marxist is that the sort of not the Marxist, but the individualism coming out in you, Elaine?
Sure. I think I was just thinking about what really interested me when I was starting to write Via Vera was thinking about, well, actually, what would it be like to be part of a group like that, and how would that affect your personal relationships? Because it's not that, if you're a sort of an armed resistance fighter, that you just put aside any sort of personal feelings or anything. So I was sort of thinking through, well, actually, what would that be like? What would that be like being in love with someone who goes out every day and might not come back because they might get killed, and what might you do in those circumstances? So yeah, it kind of, Therese's story kind of developed from there.
Yeah, often when I was reading it, I would sort of wish that he wouldn't come back, but but her, I mean, Therese is an interesting character, really, because in a way she disparages non-violent resistance in a huge long monologue in your book, and condones indiscriminate killing, but at the same time she shows compassion to Quiller when she's taken hostage. And we know Quiller is a central character from Chimi, from the powerful planet that came to try and develop or create reconciliation. Is that conflict between compassion and violence on one hand and solidarity and individual concern something you wanted to show in the human being? They may be faced with all sorts of, dialectical conflicts, but at the bottom they're a human being.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important. I don't believe that anybody is just flat out evil or flat out irredeemable. I think everybody is still human, regardless of the absolutely terrible things that they've done. And I kind of think with Therese, I mean, she does sort of put it to herself that the person who's kind of domestic and can be kind to Keeler and have personal relationships is kind of not the real one. The real one is the person who commits the violent acts. But nevertheless, she still does have she still has the ability to be kind and sympathetic and so on. And I think that's important, because I think nobody's one-dimensional, and one-dimensional characters would be very boring to read about in a book.
Yeah, I know. I remember when I did a meeting with Joe Berry, who worked with the man who had killed her father in the Brighton bombing. And this man was such a lovely man, and he was doing a professional job, and they were working together to get reconciliation. And when you see a person, you cannot quite see violence in them, you see good in them. And it all that comes out in your book. It's quite interesting. But you also, have Chimi is a central factor in this, the most powerful of all the planets. And there is not a United Nations, there's a United Planets in your book. And, Chimi dominates it. And the world order is like America dominated the United Nations. The world order is dominated by Chimi. Were you making that comparison as well?
Yes, very much so. I mean, there is very definitely a sense in which Chime, they're not like the Americans. I mean, their culture is very different. And I have some short stories where I talk more about sort of Chime culture, but I was quite careful not to make them just seem like sort of Americans in space. But certainly in sort of galactic politics terms, that they're occupying the slot that America occupies in our world, if you like. Simply because I think given that geopolitics for the last however many decades has been so dominated by the supremacy of America, and how other powers deal with that, and how we as people deal with that, I didn't feel that I could really reflect on modern politics, do my kind of politics in space without having a kind of a American-like figure.
Well, you say that, and I saw that in your book because I know you, and I think I would have seen that anyway. But lots of people will see it as a story; they won't see that at all. Do you think people can read your book and not get involved in the politics? Don't even understand there's a political dimension? It's just a good book.
I would hope so. I mean, I wouldn't want to think that I'd written a book that you had to have kind of an interest in politics to get, or a degree in politics to understand, or anything like that. I mean, I hope that it's an interesting personal story, and that it's an exciting story. I suppose what I would really like is if people pick it up thinking that they're not interested in politics, they just want a good story, and maybe it makes them think about what the message might be. But I tried very hard not to make it just a political treatise, so I hope that came off.
Well, it did come off because of the way you treat the characters, and we talked about Therese, but let's look at Quiller. I mean, she's a really interesting person. She's the negotiator from the big power, Chimi. I've learned to pronounce it Chimi. I was always saying Climby, but it's Chimi. And you show this person who, as a person who likes power. She's a careerist. She goes to try and negotiate a peace because she thinks it's good for her career. She thinks she has the ability to do it. But then she gets taken hostage, she gets captured, and the whole world changes. She begins to see things differently. She sees things differently in relationship with Therese. She almost becomes a Kaduka for Jebba and the indigenous people as well. And she ends up a very, very different person to the one she began to. So do you sort of see a sort of change process in your book that all humans can go through when they're faced with different, emergencies and tragedies in environments?
Yeah, I think so too. I think to an extent. I mean, I think partly what happens to I always imagine it as Keeler rather than Quiller, but I think either is fine. I mean, neither of us can pronounce Chima names properly. it's reasonable approximation. But I think what happens to her, I mean, it's partly because she's taken out of her environment. Even though she's had this glittering career where she's gone to all these planets, she's really, before, she's always been very much sort of cocooned in, okay, this is how the Chime work, this is her organization that she's working for, and she hasn't really had to confront the reality of what her people are doing on all these different planets until she's taken hostage and she ends up at Via Vera, and that helps her see, not just Ben and Ty differently, but it helps her see the Chime differently. She hasn't had an external perspective on them before, and I think that's really important. It's kind of being determines consciousness,
Yeah, and she has this sidekick that she brings with her, doesn't she? Whose name I can't remember, and you're never quite sure whose side he's on, and you're never quite sure whether he's trying to get her job. And so you have this rivalry, professional rivalry in your book as well, that can take a dark side.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what I was thinking there is, I think that there are sort of two sides really to the Chima. There's a side that Keeler represents, which is all the we're doing this for your good and we just want to help Ben and Ty, and then she really believes that. She really believes that she's on a sort of a humanitarian mission in that sense. But then there's kind of the darker side, and her assistant Dufevre maybe represents that side a bit more. And he's from an outer Chime planet, whereas Keeler is kind of Chime aristocracy, and I think that's quite telling, because that then always is the sort of people that you get to do your dirty work, the people who are outsiders anyway.
There's also another interesting character in your book. I hope I can pronounce it. Ihanakan.
Yeah.
Now, he's one of the Taran people. He's a Jebba. They're the indigenous people. Bit of Ursula Quinn, anarchist in you there when you deal with him. And he brings a totally different perspective, doesn't he? He brings a perspective of wisdom, of intuitive knowledge, of going back to nature in a way. And away from the sort of material conflicts that are going on. Why did you bring that into the story?
Well, I wanted to have somebody that was, or some people that were really alien. Because the thing is, I mean, the Chime are alien. They aren't human. They have all sorts of differences between sort of Chime society and human society. But they are, they are a class society. So they're quite, in a way, they're quite recognizable. Whereas the thing with the Jebba is that they aren't a class society. They're really, really different from us. And none of the characters, the other characters really quite understand what's going on with the Jebba, but they are really important. And I think it's partly because I think a lot of the time when I was thinking about Ben and Ty, I was thinking of it in terms of the sort of South American countries in our world. And it seemed to me that the presence of actually indigenous people, rather than just the Terran colonists, was really important. So there's all sorts of those sorts of things going on there.
And they, in a way, took to the idea of the Caduca in a different way, didn't they? I mean, do you want to explain that?
Okay, so the Caduca for the Jebba is a kind of a mystical figure that is a sort of, it's like a mystical leader concept, but the leader doesn't do anything. You kind of it's kind of a leader who's empty, so it's a sort of a hollowness at the center. So you find someone who to be the Kaduka, and they sit in a hut and they're fed and they're looked after, and they don't do anything at all, but that's the point. And this is tremendously inspirational, and the Jeban community who has a Kaduka, then sort of they lead the Jeba, and it's all this very important thing. So they see it as something that just sort of happens to you. But obviously, finding someone who can be a Kaduka is completely subjective. So this is presumably something that Jeban society does when they're ready to move to achieve or whatever it is. So I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but hopefully that's explained a little bit about Jeban mythology.
Well, okay. I'll tell you what I saw in it, and you can tell me how wrong I am. In a way, the Caduca, in terms of, the Jeba and so on, it seems to me it's an almost Taoist view, and that, once you name it, it's lost its meaning, the Caduca. It's sort of the underbelly intuitiveness of people that come out in indigenous societies, and many people think that we have lost. Am I reading that wrongly?
No, I think that's I think that's a useful way of thinking about it. Yeah, I mean the thing with the Jebo is that they are always very difficult to pin down, as you say. As soon as you start describing it, then it's like, no, but it's not quite like that. And certainly they have all sorts of thoughts about things being relational and not being able to pin things down and so on. So yeah, no, I think that's pretty good.
Well, another question I might have got wrong. I think why you did that is because you wrote a book on the French nobility and the Vergicinian Crusade, yeah? And,
yeah.
I wonder whether any of that inspired in you, because the Cathars in Languedoc, I think it was the 12th century, who were sort of killed by the Orthodox Catholic Church, they had a Gnostic view of the world, which is a bit like the Jeba. It was, it was a world that said that you really need to gain intuitive knowledge to get an understanding of where you are and what the world is, because the world is a constant conflict between good and evil. And I get a feeling that the Kaducha, in a way, represents that intuitive knowledge. And your knowledge of the Languedocs in that period may have consciously or unconsciously influenced you.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, partly about intuitive knowledge, maybe, but I think the Jeba don't have the same conception that we do about good and evil. And nor do the Chime, incidentally. I mean, that's very much a human concept that I haven't thought of my alien races having. So it would be different. I mean, I think the Jebo aren't Cathars, but that's interesting. Because I don't think there's any connection at all between my fiction and my academic writing, but maybe there is secretly.
Well, I think there's probably connections between our unthought thoughts when we write very often. They come out. I mean, that's a description of poetry, but it's in fiction as well, isn't it? I mean, do you get the feeling that thoughts are coming out that you never realized you had until you had it down on paper?
Oh, yes, very much so. I mean, I'm sure it's incredibly annoying when authors say, oh, well, the characters told me to do X, but that is very much the experience of writing. For all that that I plan everything, sometimes things do just sort of develop organically. And when you look back and you realize that you've made a connection that you didn't realize that you were making when you were writing it. And that's really when it's really started taking off. So yeah, I think you're right that a lot of it is unconscious.
But when you write a novel, I mean, it gives you a chance, doesn't it? I mean, when you write nonfiction, like you did on your book on Marx and climate change, you're not going to go off into a sort of fantasy land, but fiction gives you the absolute opportunity to do that. And science fiction particularly gives you that. It gives you a chance to, get your own ideas in order that are floating around your head and somehow don't always fit in with your belief system or a dogma. And so you use a novel in a way to sort of express that and get it out. Were you certain of your ideas, or did you use the novel in a way to try and sort things out?
I think I became more certain in the process of writing it, which, like I said, it took quite a long time. And you're right. I think I probably became, and certainly some things I think I'll still are still a debate in the sense, like we talked about Therese and her speech about violence. I mean, I think that's something that, I mean, I think I agree with her to the extent that I think that the situation that Via Vera and the people of Benantai are in, that non-violent resistance probably wasn't going to cut it, but the extent to which violence is permissible, and the extent to which certainly Via Vera's style of really horrific violence is permissible, that's a different thing. So I think those are things that I'm not necessarily confident that I've got absolutely my final line forever on. So yeah, it's a debate.
Yeah, it's a debate within yourself, and it's a debate people can have as well. I mean, the person that is most like your book, and it's a great compliment to say this, I know you'll agree with this, is Ursula Le Guin. I mean, her book, The Dispossessed, which she looks at interplanetary conflict as well, and which, expresses her political views. She was not a Marxist, she was an anarchist, and they came out in that book. I mean, did she have an influence on you? Because there are so many similarities about your approach, if not your belief systems, but about your approach to doing it.
Yes, I mean, I love Ursula Le Guin. She's definitely one of my major inspirations, and I think what I've taken from her is that idea of what you can use science fiction for. I mean, very much, I think her things like The Dispossessed, but also a lot of her short stories. I mean, a lot of her short stories are kind of anthropology in space, in the sense that, okay, you take a society and you change a variable, like you have, okay, people only have sex for, are sex 3 days in a month or whatever, and what would that do to the society? And you use that to explore how gender works in our society. So it's that kind of idea that that's what you can do by telling stories set on other planets, I think, is my main inspiration from her. But also, I mean, because I read it all the time, so if I've got any style at all, I think that's because I've learned from Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah, and it gives you the freedom, doesn't it, to to explore in a way where you're not constricted. Mind you, if you plan as much as you do have some constriction, but you must have spontaneous moments when you say, to hell with my plan.
Oh yeah. Well, you have to then change the plan, and you have to make sure that it works. I mean, some things are non-negotiable. I mean, things to do with the structure and sort of pacing and things. You do have, once you've worked out the structure, you do have to keep to it. But yeah, I mean, obviously you do have to let your writing develop as you're going along. Otherwise, it'd just be very sterile. But I also, I mean, part of the advantage of writing science fiction is that no one can fact check you. Well, certainly not on political happenings, because it hasn't happened yet, because it's 900 years in the future. But I do have to have an enormous spreadsheet with sort of timeline of all the different races and all sorts of things that have happened, so that I don't contradict myself. So I do have to keep track of all of that.
Did you ever get confused when you were writing it and find that you done something with the character that you shouldn't have done because you didn't realize you were doing it, or were you absolutely clear right the way through?
Oh no, I'm forever having to look things up. Forever, right? And not just kind of dates and when things happen, but things like Chime body language. Forever having to sort of go back and proofread and say, oh, I said she shrugged there. Do the Chime shrug? I'm not sure. Let me look that up, and all those sorts of things. So yeah, proofreading even quite close to publication was still picking some of those things up.
Well, I mean, it's quite a long book, it's a complex book. How long did it take? And you took a lot of notes, you said, longer than the book. So how long did it take you to write it?
Oh, well, I mean, I've actually been writing it for about 15 years, but I wasn't working on it all that time. So, I mean, I wrote the very first draft, which was really quite different from how it ended up, about 15 years ago. And then I sort of put it aside and wrote a load of science fiction short stories. And then I sort of came back to it and rewrote it almost completely from beginning to end, and then dithered about with it for another couple of years. So, yeah, I suppose 3 or 4 years of concentrated work, if you see what I mean.
Well, I mean, you have a job, you have a political life, and you've done this as well. So that's quite amazing. Do you get any sleep?
Not enough.
Not enough. Okay, so you've done this book, and I mean, it is a really great book to read. What's your next project?
Oh, well, the next project I'm working on is an academic one. I'm working on a book about the Carcassonne Revolution in 1303. which I hope will be a kind of a popular history thing. So look out for that. I will probably write some more science fiction short stories, I think, and then I think I will come back and see what's happened on Ben and Ty. Because at the moment, I think where the Caduca ends is kind of now in my head. So I don't know what's going to happen next because it hasn't happened next. So I have to give it a little while to shake out, and then I'll come back and see.
So do you mean it might be a sequel, or you might do something totally different?
I don't think it'll be a direct sequel, but I think whatever else I write is set in my kind of my fictional universe will refer to events on Ben and Ty, because I think it's going to have universe-wide importance. So some of the characters might appear in other things, I think.
Okay, well, I mean, I think it's a book really worth reading, and I think people should go out and read it. And we've got one person on here saying they're going to go out and get the book right away. So, we've come to the end of the 30 minutes. If people wanted to get the book and make contact with you, where would they go?
Right, well, it is in all good bookshops, and indeed at the All Good Bookshop in Turnpike Lane. So they very kindly hosted my sort of online book launch a few weeks ago. So if you're inspired to buy the book, please do get it from them. But you can also get it from, Amazon and Waterstones and so on and so on. If you want to get in touch with me, my website is redpuffin.net, or I'm on Twitter, Graham Leigh.
Okay, well, thank you for doing that. It's it's been an interesting sort of interview just to find out what is going on in your mind as you write, and how you bring complex ideas and conflicting ideas you have within yourself and in the world together to make a story. And I mean, you've not only done a good political job, but you've also told a good story. And you've got love and passion in it, so that gives it a good element as well as politics. So it's not just politics; it really is about conflict. It is about passion. It is about love. It's about a lot more than just putting politics into space, as you put it. So I would say to people, please go and get it and read it. It was really worthwhile to do. So, Elaine, thank you for doing it. And, when you've done your next book, let us know and we'll do another interview. But for now, we'll end this interview now.